Senate 789, an act to repeal certain obsolete laws relating to Indians.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Obernolte, each will control 20 minutes. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend the remarks and include extraneous material on the measure under consideration.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of S789, the repealing existing substandard provisions, encouraging reconciliation with the Tribes Act, introduced by Senator Rounds of South Dakota. Here in the House, the bill is led by my friend and colleague, Representative O'Halloran. This bill will repeal 11 antiquated federal laws that pertain to American Indians and Alaskan Natives. As this body is well aware, federal Indian law has existed since the foundation of the United States, and it governs the relationship between the federal government, American Indians, and Alaskan Natives. The policies and principles of federal Indian law have undergone many transformations throughout American history, as it was once the policy of the federal government to commit violence and forced displacement against tribal communities. Although the federal Indian laws of today are better at upholding the principles of tribal self-determination and sovereignty, many laws that reflect the prior federal policy during the eras of genocide, removal, assimilation, or termination still remain as law. S789 will address this concern by repealing 11 outdated statutes, many of which pertain to the colonial and Indian boarding school eras. I want to thank Senator Rounds, Representative O'Halloran, for introducing this legislation and ensuring that the federal law reflects the respect that we hold for Indian country. I urge my colleagues to support the legislation, and I yield back.
Reserves. Gentleman from California, Mr. Obernolte is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I might consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of S789, the repealing existing substandard provisions encouraging conciliation with Tribes Act, also known as the Respect Act. This legislation would repeal several antiquated and outdated federal laws directed at Native Americans. It is a bill that is long overdue. During the mid-1800s and the mid-1900s, the federal government attempted to assimilate Native Americans by disrupting traditional community structures and ways of life. S789 repeals 11 statutes passed during that time that are obsolete and have been unenforced for decades. Federal Indian policy today recognizes the unique sovereign status of tribal governments and supports government-to-government relationships between the United States and each of the hundreds of recognized tribes across our country. S789 is part of that policy, acknowledging that these laws unfortunately existed and that they should be formally repealed and removed from the United States Code. I urge adoption of this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield as much time as you may consume to the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Chair of the Subcommittee, Representative Ledger-Fernandez.
Ms. Ledger-Fernandez is recognized for as much time as she may consume.
Thank you so much, Chairman Grijalva. This bill does acknowledge the long and painful history of American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians in this country. I support S789 because it moves us one step closer to recognizing and remembering that painful history, but then addressing it by removing from our statutes that which is so ugly, harmful, and painful. This bill repeals those outdated and offensive legislative provisions that rob Native American populations of their dignity and their sovereignty for decades. In New Mexico, we are keenly aware of the damage inflicted upon Native youth and families by so-called reform schools, coercive policies around work, and countless other forms of mistreatment. Legislation like S789 reminds us of that painful history, but we cannot only acknowledge historical wrongs, we must do the work to make things right. I'm pleased to voice my support for this bill and look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues from both parties to fulfill the federal government's full trust and treaty responsibilities. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Arizona.
I have no, Mr. Speaker, I have no further request for time. We're
Gentlemen-
prepared to close, and I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I urge adoption of this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
I urge my colleagues to support the legislation and yield back the balance.
All time having expired, the question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate